Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to the third in a series of Tuesday night lectures. This has been a Tuesday night series like no other due to the COVID virus. When Louis and I discussed it at one point, he thought he might cancel the entire program, and I encouraged him to please try and have it on Zoom, have it on webinars, because I think you will have a very major audience. And this is the third in the series. And tonight we have Janice Stein speaking on the US election. We know that we have sent out 650 links. We have a maximum of 500, so I hope that everybody got on. And with roughly 1.5 people per computer, we expect that there's an audience in the area of 700 to 800 people. This is an election like no other. I think we have to go back to the Civil War of 1860, that very difficult election, or 1864, or 1932 in the middle of the Depression, or 1940 and World War II to have anything like this. The whole world is watching on tenterhooks and very much involved with what the result might be. We are so fortunate to have Janice Stein with us, a person not only of extensive knowledge and a brilliant analytical mind, but just a wonderful person to work with and to be with. And for those of you who don't know her, you will agree with me fully in that description before this evening is over. Everybody knows who Janice Stein is. Not everyone knows who I am, so I better say a word about myself. I became involved on the board of the Shar in 1970, and I have been there ever since. So I'm perhaps the longest serving member ever of the congregation board. And I think I've chaired just about every committee in this synagogue. But what about the political aspect? Well, in 1976, we all remember when the United Nations passed a vicious resolution calling Zionism is racism, only 30 years after the end of the Holocaust. It drove me crazy. I became active and as a one-man show marched off to Ottawa and didn't accomplish too much. But I guess people heard enough that shortly later I was invited to join the Canada-Israel Committee. And there's a reason I'm telling you all this, because my first chairperson was none other than Annie Gross, Janice's mother. What a privilege it was to serve under her and learn the ropes from the brilliant Annie Gross. And you can imagine the thrill that I feel to be doing this interview and having this conversation with her amazing daughter tonight. So let me tell you something about Janice, and then we'll get right into the questions that are before us this evening. Janice Stein is the Belzberg Professor of Conflict Management in the Department of Political Science, and she is the founding director of the Munk School of Global Affairs at the University of Toronto, Canada's most prestigious think tank on geopolitics. She is a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada and an honorary foreign member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. She wrote widely on negotiation theory, foreign policy decision-making, and international conflict and conflict management. She authored over 80 books, book chapters, and articles. Stein's first book was Rational Decision-Making, Israel's Security Choices, 1961. That first book won the Edgar Furness Award for Outstanding Contribution to the Study of National Security and Civilian Military Education. Other works on Jewish or Middle East subjects include Powder Keg in the Middle East, The Struggle for Gulf Security, Peacekeeping in the Middle East, and Contemporary Anti-Semitism. She is also the co-author with Eugene Lang of the prize-winning work, The Unexpected War, Canada and Kandahar, and in her most recent book, Diplomacy in the Digital Age. Professor Stein was a Massey lecturer in 2001. She was awarded the Molson Prize by the Canada Council for an outstanding contribution by a social scientist to public debate and has received 4 honorary doctorates, and one that I'm especially proud of, which is the one from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. She is a member of the Order of Canada and the Order of Ontario. In the media, I am sure you have been unable to miss her. She has provided commentary for networks such as CBC, CTV, TVO, CNN, and columns and comments for the Globe and Mail and the National Post. Let me just say a few words about Janice Stein as a professor, as an academic, and as a speaker. Whether it's economics, geopolitics, or international security and terrorism, few people have a better understanding of global issues than Professor Janice Stein. Her dynamic presentations provide a unique perspective into what's really happening around the world. And we will deal with these tonight, from China to Russia, to the Middle East, to Europe, and what it means to her audiences. Professor Stein's presentations not only connect the dots regarding key events, but provide a look at where things are headed and where the potential dangers and opportunities may lie. Both realistic and hopeful, she leaves her audiences with a better understanding of current global issues and a clear, compelling vision of the future, which is what we will hope to achieve in this very complex milieu and subject tonight. The pride of her life are her 2 sons and her young grandson, Noah. I cannot leave this bio without saying a word about her husband, Michael, who passed away this past year. Her husband, Michael, was not only a wonderful life partner to Janice. Michael was a brilliant scholar in his own right, an outstanding professor in political science who was loved by his students, by his family, by his colleagues, and all who knew him. I had the privilege of knowing Michael, and in him, we had the pleasure of knowing and learning from an outstanding individual, and he is a person who will be greatly missed by all, but especially by his family. I would now like to begin the subject on hand. And Janice, if you don't mind, by the way, if I'm off track or if there's a subject that you'd rather talk about and I'm leading you in a direction that you don't want to go, please feel free to jump in at any time and put us back on course. But I would like to begin in an unusual way. I'd like to begin in 1976. And I am picking that year because that was another year that a smaller community, the Canadian community, and particularly the Quebec community, was filled with angst. The Parti Québécois was running on a separatist platform for election. But no one thought they were going to win, at least no one. until I ran into Janice Stein and she said to me, Stephen, I have to tell you something. The Parti Québécois is going to win this election. No one was calling for that victory. And of course, Janice was absolutely right. The Parti Québécois won, and a lot of chaos followed, but we survived it. And I have a feeling whatever the chaos comes out of this election, we will also survive it. Albeit exactly how, we will learn from Professor Stein tonight. So I don't want to put Professor Stein on the spot with a prediction, but with her marvelous forecast right on the button in 1976, I can't avoid asking you the question, Janice, of how you see this election turning out, if not in terms of an absolute result and decision. Maybe you can give us some idea of how close it is or how wrong the polls are, which seem to be suggesting something in the area of a 7 to 8 to 9% margin of victory for Biden. Janice, how do you think this election is going to turn out?
So thank you very, very much, Stephen, for those warm words about my mother, about Michael. And let me just say what a pleasure it is to be with you, what a pleasure it is to be part of this lecture series. Montreal is home for me. It's where I grew up. And I can tell you that very often I went to synagogue with friends on Saturday and spent many wonderful times in your synagogue. So it's a personal pleasure for me. To come to this election, I wish I could start this evening off by saying to everybody, don't worry, but I can't. And here's why I can't. First of all, national polls do not really matter. That's an attribute of the US electoral system. I can tell you with 100% confidence that California will vote Democratic and that New York will vote Democratic. But that's not saying very much. We have 50 separate elections that are being held in the United States next Tuesday. And the results are determined by how each state votes, because they have a unique system of electoral college. People vote for the electors. So there are 8 states that are going to tell the story next Tuesday. And when you look at the polls in those 8 states, they are much closer. There are 4 or 5% margins. In some cases, too, these are within what we call the margin of error. The poll the vote could actually go either side. There are 2, so what I can tell you is there is a path to victory for Donald Trump. And anyone who says it is impossible that he will win the election next week is engaging, I suspect, in what we call wishful thinking. It's true that Biden is more likely to win, but there is a path to victory for both candidates. And so I have to say at this point, this is not what you want to hear. I have to say, other things being equal, it is still too close to call. Now, on Tuesday evening, I'll tell you what I'm going to be watching. I'm going to be watching the results in Florida. And why Florida? Not only because it's one of the biggest of those 8 states, but because they count their mail-in ballots before the election, unlike the others who are going to count after. If Biden wins Florida, the election is over. If Trump wins Florida, and they're neck and neck in that race right now, neck and neck. If Trump wins Florida, we are in not only for a very long night, but I suspect for a very long week or 10 days, since there is a reasonable likelihood, unless Joe Biden wins by a landslide, there is a reasonable likelihood that this election will be contested every step of the way. And I just want to add one more comment before you go to the next question, Stephen. There is a lot of discussion out there about violence, about what people call a soft civil war. I think we have to keep things in perspective here. And here I can be more optimistic. There are legal processes to resolve these disputes. Of course, there's always the possibility of isolated violence, but I am reasonably confident, although it may stretch out and the tension may go on, that the United States is resilient enough to resolve even a contested election where the polarization is this sharp through institutional processes, not through violence in the streets.
Janice, if the election is as close as you suggest it might be, and in that you differ from most of the polls, and there's no question that I take the validity of your opinion way above other polls, and I've learned that from past experience. Given that situation, and given that Trump himself has said that he can only lose if the election itself is rigged, what kind of tension are we looking at for days and days? And how dangerous is this as a threat to the American democracy? I know people are really worried about this. Some don't sleep at night. And they say, what is happening to our democracy? How much should we be worrying about this? Or are the institutions strong enough that these worries are exaggerated?
I believe the worries are exaggerated. Let me walk you quickly through what might happen if the election is closer than the current national polls are predicting. So we'll have a series of challenges. The first will be to many of the mail-in ballots, because they have to verify the signature. In some cases, these signatures are 30 years old, and it's entirely possible the Trump campaign will take thousands of these, if not hundreds of thousands of these signatures to court. And the courts will rule on this, but the courts will rule, frankly. Second possibility, that some Republican governors who are unhappy with the result will nominate independent slates of electors. And the Electoral College meets in the middle of December. And there will be competing slates of electors. So it will be a messy process. But here's, I think, an argument that people are not paying enough attention to. Trump has appointed 3 Supreme Court justices as of yesterday to the Supreme Court of the United States. And these justices are individually each known for their social conservatism, by which I mean on issues like abortion and minority rights. There's a whole set of issues which we call social conservatism. But all 3 justices, and this is what people are not talking about, are constitutionalists. Their highest value is protection of the Constitution. They're what we call originalists. They believe in the original interpretation of the Constitution. I have little doubt that if it comes in any way to a choice between advancing Donald Trump's political ambitions and protecting the Constitution of the United States, every one of the judges that Trump appointed will choose to protect the Constitution of the United States. And that's why I come to the judgment that the institutions of the United States will be strong enough. Is what we're seeing a blow to US democracy? Absolutely. One of the things I was most struck by, because I read the world press on a regular basis, was a comment by a Nigerian colleague who said, I feel sorry for Americans. I feel sorry. This democracy was one that we look up to around the world, and look what they're going through. The damage that has already been done to the example that the US had set in the last century as an exemplar of democracy is in some ways almost irreparable. The damage will not go away even if Joe Biden wins the presidency. It will take, people have lost confidence. We in Canada have lost confidence in the reliability of the United States. It will take years to repair the damage, even if Joe Biden wins.
I just wanted to mention that people can write their questions on the chat, but they may want to wait because the chances are we have such a broad spectrum of areas to cover that will probably cover your questions, but the chat will be open for that and we will try to get to them. That's an encouraging response, Janice. I happen to agree with it. I think that they have their conservative point of views and interpretations, but I would not question the integrity of most of the judges, and that is our hope. And maybe later on, if we have time, there are a few issues that I'd like to bring up about the Supreme Court. But one other thing that bothers me about this campaign is something that we call in Judaism, sinat chinam, groundless hatred. And I'd like to read a quote that you may comment on, something that bothers me really deeply as a human being. After all, the United States, for us, certainly next to Israel, was the Golden Medina. This was the ultimate, this was the land of liberty, of equality, of opportunity. We all grew up loving Canada, but looking up to the United States as the ultimate. And I have a section here where I talk about, with numbers, about how the United States has gone down in the eyes of the world. But I just want to read this little quote to you because it's very disturbing. The two sides have come to view each other not as opponents, but as deeply evil. If you are a believer in climate change, re-electing Trump is literally the end of the world. If taxes are your issue, you think a Biden victory will bankrupt you. If your top concern is health care, you think a Biden loss will kill you, especially in this time of COVID and the way Mr. Trump has been handling. Historians say that in the past bouts of insecurity and self-doubt, Americans often focused on foreign threats, the ideological battle with the Soviet Union during the Cold War, the worry about unrest in the Middle East, terrorist attacks, and so forth. But now, the worry on the right that a Democratic win would plunge the nation into a catastrophic socialism and riots in the streets, and the fear on the left that a Trump victory would produce a turn towards totalitarianism have created a perilous moment. The idea that if the other side wins, we're in for it. And this troubles me so much. Real life examples, really good friends, where one has said, if Trump wins 4 more years, I can't stay in the United States. I've got to leave. It's too horrible. And another person says, if the Democrats take over and we're going to underfund the police and we're going to have riots and so forth, I can't stay in the United States. So this kind of extremist thought and behavior, this hatred where people used to unite and push their hand in their breast and we all thought of the United States as the ideal. We now have this hatred that is scary.
It is scary. And you're right to put your finger on this, Stephen. The polarization in the United States is probably the most worrying long-term trend. But I'm going to find a silver lining in a minute, okay, for that too. But when we think about democracy, what is the hallmark of a democracy? You lose with grace. That is what defines a democracy. And you lose, that's it, right? When you strip away all the academic language, it's characterized by losing with grace. And why can you lose with grace? Because it's not an all-out war. Everything doesn't depend on this one election. And 4 years from now, you're going to compete again and you stand a reasonable chance of winning, and the game is not fixed. Well, that's what that's what has now disappeared in the United States. And you're absolutely right. People on both sides of this election feel everything is at stake, and if the other side wins, it's catastrophic. A lot of Democratic sympathizers are very worried about the violence that Trump-inspired militias will engage in if he doesn't win on Tuesday evening. It's hard, though, to understand that there are a large group on the right is convinced that the Democrats are planning a coup against President Trump and are just as frightened, just as fearful, and just as angst-ridden as the Democrats. Now that bodes very, very badly for the future of democracy. When we look at history, the democracies that collapse because they lose the ability to lose with grace. They lose that ability because they lose confidence in the fairness of the process. Now, where's the silver lining, you might ask me, because this polarization has been deepening. It didn't start with Donald Trump, it was there before. You could start it with Newt Gingrich, or you could go all the way back to Barry Goldwater, or you could trace it to Bernie Sanders. It doesn't matter where you started. It has been getting worse and worse and worse every year. So here's a silver lining, and some of you are not going to be thrilled with what I'm going to say right now, but I'm going to say it anyway. The core of the Trump vote, the core of that vote are white men without college degrees. That is the core of his base. That is a shrinking demographic in the United States. Women, the white women who indicated last time they would vote for Trump have left. And COVID is a big part of it. His management of COVID has driven white women out of the Republican Party for this election. So white men without college degrees are just fewer and fewer and fewer. First of all, some are aging. I say that knowing the color of my own hair, but some are aging, and so they are a shrinking factor in the US political equation. Secondly, a larger and larger proportion of young Americans continue to get college degrees. So I think we're in for a tough decade in the United States. If Joe Biden wins this election, these tensions do not go away. The polarization doesn't go away. I can perfectly well imagine if Joe Biden wins, that Donald Trump moves into the Trump Hotel down the street and starts a television network, the Trump TV network, that outdoes Fox and broadcasts every night and amplifies these voices. So the polarization continues, but it is time limited over the next 10 or 15 years. The challenge, are these institutions strong enough to withstand the pressure that they're under right now? And the pressure is very real. We are not that polarized in Canada, just for the record. It's very interesting. I just saw a poll that will stun many of you who are listening to this by a very, very good pollster, Greg Lyle, who every 4 years does a series of panel interviews with Americans and Canadians and looks at values, right? And the latest result I saw just last week, and they were really fascinating, on 20 different values, on 18 of those 20, Canadians and Americans were indistinguishable. Not what you expected me to say, right? On what two were we different from Americans? Well, the first one's humorous. Americans are really committed to hunting, and we're not in Canada, except for our Indigenous communities, for whom it's a matter of a way of life. But hunting does not come up very highly on Canadian values. The second one, social conservative. Rights of LGBT communities, rights of minorities, women's rights, and abortion rights. That's where we differ from the United States. But we're not that different, but we're less extreme. And the depth of the difference in the Canadian public is much smaller than it is in the United States. That polarization should be deeply, deeply worrying to everybody. And I don't have to add that social media doesn't help.
I'll come to Canada a little later, but there's no question that this is a deep concern. And if we don't handle it well, there could be problems.
Yeah, very bad consequences.
We could say a lot more about this, but I would like to move on to Israel and then Canada. In Israel versus the American Jewish community, I like to say we have 70 versus 70. A split like perhaps we've never had before. 70% of Jewish Israelis are pro-Trump. They think that Trump has done more for the country than any other president, and they're paying it back with great support. It is very different in the United States. Trump is extremely unpopular with the vast majority of Jews, with the exception of the Orthodox and the ultra-Orthodox and some of the conservative and wealthier classes of Jews. A lot of people that I've talked to are concerned. Biden is an old friend of Israel, but will he continue what some have regarded as the greatest success of Trump, the Abraham Accords, the opening up of relationships with UAE, with Bahrain, with Sudan now, and the rumors are that Saudi Arabia and Egypt are not far behind in entering a new kind of arrangement. Now, I know no one knows more about this than you do, so I'd like to get your reaction to that before I go further into this split between Israel and the diaspora.
So there's no question there is a growing difference of opinion between Israel and the diaspora. That started also before Trump, right? The fundamental differences are that what we call liberalism is under strain in Israel because the ascension of rightist parties and religious parties working in concert one with the other. So the liberal values that attracted so many North American Jews are under pressure in Israel. But I have a very different perspective. And bear with me, all my Montrealer friends who are not going to like what I'm going to say right now. But I think that I understand the importance of the relationship with UAE and Bahrain, but this is not something that Trump did. There's been a relationship between Saudi Arabia and Israel, between Bahrain, between the UAE primarily for 25 years. It is the worst kept secret in Israel. You could not go to Israel or go to the Gulf and not have this talked about openly. Not only was there intelligence sharing, there was political coordination. This was a long-standing relationship that frankly just came out of the closet. Now, why did it come out of the closet at this particular moment? Because what unites these countries with Israel is a shared fear of Iran. And in a sense, when Donald Trump walked away unilaterally, and you can tell I do not agree that that was the right decision, walked away unilaterally from an agreement that had been reached with Iran to control its nuclear program for at least 15 years, The Saudis, the Emiratis were more alarmed and looked around the neighborhood and saw the United States withdrawing from the Middle East. That did not start with Trump. That started with Obama. And we are in the middle of a sustained withdrawal from the United States from the Middle East. This is not something that we like to talk about, but it's happening. Evidence for this, look at the parties that are involved right now in Yemen or in Syria. Who are they? Russia, Iran, Turkey. The United States is distinguished by its absence. It has walked away for all intents and purposes from the Middle East. So the Emiratis look at this and they're worried about Iran, and they're more worried about Iran because that agreement is no longer a framework to control Iran's nuclear ambitions. And they look around the neighborhood, who shares that concern and who, by the way, is not moving? Israel. There is a convergence of interest between these countries. Donald Trump merely provided the icing on the cake, and I, for one, support the fact that he did this and give him credit for being the broker in this relationship. But there are much deeper forces at work in this part of the world. The question I get asked most often is, what will Joe Biden do with respect to Iran, right? Not with respect to Israel, that's not the problem, and not with respect to Saudi Arabia either, but what will he do with respect to Iran?
That was my next question.
Well, there we go, Stephen. I think the odds are absolutely overwhelming that he will go back to the negotiating table with Iran. Will try, not necessarily to resurrect the deal that Obama signed, but to improve the deal. The Iranians are very strategic and sophisticated players. You notice there has been no provocation of the United States for the last 3 or 4 months, largely because they do not want to give Donald Trump ammunition. And I hope, and here I know you're going to disagree with me, many of you. I hope that there is, in fact, an agreement that limits the scope of Iran's nuclear program. 15 years in the Middle East is an eternity. Since Donald Trump walked away with no reason, I mean, there was no violation of the agreement by Iran. He walked away from it. The Iranians are now spinning centrifuges at a higher rate than they were before Obama and John Kerry reached that deal. That is not a good trajectory in this part of the world.
What will Biden's relationship be? I mean, how tough a negotiator will he be in terms of a new deal? And I ask that because of what you said before, which was entirely correct. The coming together of these agreements are directly the result of the fear by the Sunni Arab countries of Iran.
Yeah.
If they see Joe Biden following the Obama path, which they were very unhappy about, will they not begin to turn away from what looks like a promising development if a bunch of other countries follow that path? Or will Biden be too smart to fall into that?
I actually don't think that the relationship, especially between the Emiratis, the Saudis, who haven't, formalized it, but it doesn't matter really for the purpose of this argument. Their relationship with Israel is not dependent on what the United States does. That relationship is almost despite the United States. That relationship grew because all three of them looked up and said, the United States is not trustworthy. It's pulling back. We can't count on the United States staying in this neighborhood. So I am not concerned that that relationship, it's not a fragile relationship. It's an older one. It's been going for a long time. It will survive what Biden does. So the more relevant question is, what kind of negotiator will Biden be? And here's again something that people have not paid enough attention to. Trump stripped the State Department of the top layer. Go 4 down deep. There's nobody left, right? In the State Department. Ambassadors quit in the droves because it was so demoralized, frankly. You know, they had a Secretary of State first, Tillerson, who instituted a program review and no spending occurred. Virtually all the top talent has left that department. One of the things we all need to understand that should Biden win this presidency, whether it's the State Department, whether it's trade, the Office of the Trade Representative, which really matters to Canada, whether it's energy, which matters to Canada, it will take them at least a year to a year and a half to fill the vacancies. Trump systematically weakened every one of these departments.
No question. I'm wondering.
What I'm trying to say here, Stephen, is Biden is not going to come up fast out of the gate, even if he wins the election.
Yeah. Just coming back to the worrisome part, I'd like to just touch on the squad. I know people exaggerate their influence, and also how much pressure there will be from the left wing of the Democratic Party to change the attitude towards Israel. There's a very positive attitude. Yeah. Jews who are not pro-Trump are very worried about how people who are Zionists or very attached to Israel are very worried. Will the Democratic Party be influenced by its left wing, and will this be a negative for Israel? How do you see it, Janice?
You know, let me just take that question up one level, Stephen, and say that across the developed world, as a result of 2 factors, big government with ambitious social programming is back, all right, in a big way.
Right.
And so that gives voice to that part of the Democratic Party. So why is it back? The first reason it's back is because we've had 30 years of globalization, which at the same time as they've enriched many, have produced inequalities that are bigger than anything we've known since the Depression. We don't get populist politics for no reason, right?
Right.
Donald Trump didn't come out of nowhere. He came out of people who felt themselves and were downwardly socially mobile in many, many ways. The same is true in countries like France, Italy, and Germany, where we've had populist parties come. So there was a growing consensus that government needed to play a larger role in evening out these disparities. All right, layer on top of that COVID, where without government, frankly, we would be in a major depression. It is only what government has done in North America and in Europe and in China and in Japan, frankly, and in India that has prevented a worldwide depression that conceivably could have been greater even than we had in the 30s. So the general political climate is changing and will probably be the tone of the decade that is coming. Now, within that, how important, so I think the left of the Democratic Party will be very important on social programs and Biden is receptive. On foreign policy, I think less important. There's not a deep constituency inside the Democratic Party for a radically different foreign policy. And if I have one worry here, and I could just imagine if we were getting comments live, Stephen, what some of what I said would provoke. One of the things that concerned me very deeply with Trump's policy toward Israel he made Israel a partisan issue.
That was my next question.
That was a strategic mistake of the highest order. And I have to say the Prime Minister of Israel played right into that, fell right into that trap. It is going to take time and effort now to reverse that. And so, yes, there will be a bumpy ride, but the mistakes were made 4 years ago when Israel, and it started before, remember Prime Minister Netanyahu intervening in a US presidential election. No for any foreign government. We don't do that. You don't understand our prime minister doing that. That is just, there have been some bad mistakes here along the way.
So that was my follow-up question. I have grave concerns, having been an advocate for Israel for many years. I understand that if you don't have a bipartisan program, you end up with a weak program.
Right.
And so when we see Bibi quote that Trump has been the greatest president in the history of the United States for Israel, I think, how does the Democrats feel when they look back at all their great presidents? And the Democratic Party used to be the party for Israel, not the Republican Party. And you wonder how much damage that has done, and can we get back, and will Biden be big enough to swallow some of these things and get us back on track? But that is a big concern, and I had it down here as an underlined question. And then I wanted to end with a quote on that subject. You may want to comment first.
You know,
but then
I've had more than my fair share of opportunities to talk to prime ministers, not only in this country, but elsewhere. And one of the things about politicians, they have very long memories. They remember their friends, and they have enemies lists, right? And they have very, very long memories. That's why wise leaders don't do what the Prime Minister of Israel did. Probably the squad, as you call it, will have less impact on what Joe Biden does in the future than his memory of what the Prime Minister said at a critical moment.
There's so much more to be said on that, but I want to move quickly on to Canada and China, which are so important, and have time for questions. There was a famous story in 1969 that's been repeated over and over again. Pierre Trudeau was visiting Nixon, and he made the famous statement, and he said to Nixon, "Living next to you is in some ways like sleeping with an elephant. No matter how friendly and even-tempered is the beast, if I can call it that, one is affected by every twitch and grunt." We have not been particularly well treated by President Trump.
No.
We have been insulted, and we have been accused of undermining the security of the United States, which has justified aluminum and steel tariffs. And we've gotten ourselves into a giant pickle with Meng, and I don't know how we're going to get out of it. And I'm just wondering how you see it if Trump continues, and what you see if Biden takes over. Can we expect anything better? Because Biden also is talking about a Buy American platform.
So there's two issues in that one question. Let me talk briefly, because I know you do want to leave time for questions here, Stephen. The first is China, and let me say this. The one issue on which there is a bipartisan consensus in Washington and Congress, China is a threat to the United States. It doesn't matter much other than tone, who wins the election. We are in for, again, a decade. So to take a challenge and look into the future, we're in for a decade in which there is deepening competition between the United States and China. For a country like Canada, small, lives next door to the United States, that just makes our life more complicated. On trade, which is fundamental to this country, we live or die by what we export. It affects all your children and grandchildren's future. If Canada's capacity to export into the US market is limited, probably the biggest single issue that our current Prime Minister faced in his career were those NAFTA negotiations. And that they took everybody off every file who had any talent in order to work on that campaign. And they, frankly, Canada ran a brilliant campaign, and we interfered in US domestic politics, just so we all understand what we do. Biden, the tone will change, but there is a very tough Buy America First policy. There is already concern in Ottawa about what that will look like. People are already thinking about what we have to do as a country to get behind that wall, because a Buy America First campaign shuts many advanced Canadian manufacturers and providers of goods and services out of one of the biggest pieces of the US market. It's a real concern. So that is not going away. What we won't have, frankly, is the erratic tone, the rudeness, the unpredictability, which has driven every government, except for the government of China and Russia and North Korea, around the bend in the last 4 years.
Is there any way out of the main mess with either Biden or Trump? Well, Trump certainly has taken a political action that is not helpful. I'm not sure that Biden will be any more helpful.
Well, for the lawyers in the room, legal processes have to work their way through. And Chrystia Freeland, the Deputy Prime Minister, and the Prime Minister, when challenged on this issue, have said in unmistakable terms, it is important that the courts have their say. There's a case right now before the court in Vancouver in which she is claiming improper process, violation of her rights in the way she was arrested. That one has greater prospects of success than extradition, because the bar to extradite somebody under extradition treaties is very low. Here's what could happen. If she doesn't prevail in this round, there will be an extradition hearing late in the fall. If she loses in that round, that is when it is appropriate for the Justice Minister to consider whether there are larger considerations at stake. But the Justice Minister will not intervene before the courts have spoken.
Our hearts go out, of course, to the two Michaels, 700 days plus. And I think every Canadian feels for those two men and what they're going through.
Absolutely.
And I don't know that Biden will be any help. This will be a Canadian situation, as you say.
The only thing that Biden could do, Stephen, is get the Department of Justice to drop the charges against her. I don't think that's very likely.
There's so much to talk about, and the time is running, and we have to talk about China. I know that is the biggest part of the geopolitics for the next 20, 30 years. China will eventually be the #1 economy in the world. Its GNP in the last quarter grew at 4.9%, which is astounding. It will be the only major country to have positive growth in 2020. And so while we name it and blame it, and appropriately so, perhaps, for the Wuhan virus, which Mr. Trump calls the China virus, in the meantime, they're doing, even with whatever cheating is going on, they're doing a hell of a job in getting their economy going and keeping the virus under control. Do you
You
think,
know,
yeah, you think Biden can improve this relationship that could be tearing the world trade and the world harmony apart into another Cold War? Can we do better?
I think, as I said, that the tone under a President Biden would change. There wouldn't be the kind of inflammatory rhetoric. That having been said, we are already in an all-out competition with China, particularly on technology, before our government is a momentous decision. Leave the CFO of Huawei, Meng Wanzhou, out of the story. We have a momentous decision to make. Are we going to let China's flagship company, Huawei, build the critical digital infrastructure for the next 20 years? And part of the arguments come from our telecommunications company, two of whom already have over $1 billion worth of Huawei equipment in the prior networks. I'd say we're going to have to rip it all out. Well, my answer to that is if they build the next generation, they're going to have to rip even more out. Those are the kinds of decisions that come to the surface when there is a growing security competition between the United States and China. As I say all the time, we live next door to the United States. There are times, I'm sure, over the past 4 years, when our leaders would like to have picked us up en masse, moved the country lock, stock, and barrel, and put it somewhere in nice, sunny, warm Southern Europe, right? Our life would have been a lot easier. We can't do that. We are neighbors of the United States forever. And when it comes to a choice, there is no choice. But strategy for Canada has always been, let's avoid the choice. And that is, there's a different tone coming out of the Conservative Party than out of the Liberal Party. You can't miss it. There is a real division on that issue. But by and large, Canadian governments of all political stripes have always tried not to make the choice, even while they recognize the United States, Biden or Trump-led, is the priority for this country.
Yeah. I mean, we are where we are. We're not moving.
That's right.
It wasn't long ago when Canada was talking about diversifying its trade by having perhaps a free trade agreement with China. And we can see where that has led. That is not an option.
Even worse than that, Stephen, the original Chinese proposal, if you think about this, was for an extradition treaty with us.
Yes. Can you imagine with Hong Kong? Oh my goodness. So let's go to a couple of questions and just to mix things up. I have many more things to discuss with you, but I want to let people jump in here. A question from an attendee, private name. Can you comment on Steve Bannon? Will he continue to have an influence even if Trump is gone?
No. Will he have an influence on the Republican Party is probably the question. And that's a larger question about the future of the Republican Party. First of all, Steve Bannon has been indicted. And it's not clear that what will happen. There will have to be a trial and you can never prejudge the outcome, but his influence is more precarious. He still has an outside influence on the right wing, not of the Republican Party, but the right wing of political opinion. We have this astounding phenomenon going on of believers in what's called the QAnon conspiracy, which is fueled by right-wing web and media platforms, and it's not restricted to the United States. I saw data last week that some 400,000 people in Germany believe the arguments that there is child trafficking by the Democratic Party, accusations for which there's no evidence whatsoever. And Breitbart News, which Steve Bannon founded, traffics in these kinds of conspiracy theories. So the real issue, the bigger question to me, what becomes of the Republican Party should Donald Trump lose? So one of the things that we know about political parties is when leaders lose, they are gone.
Yeah.
And the Republican Party will be open for the taker over these next 4 years. And there is, of course, the vast majority of the Republican Party and Republican activists have been shut out by Donald Trump. They are angry. They want their party back. And I can tell you, they are organizing now. They've been organizing for months to take over the Republican National Committee and the levers of the party so they recapture the Republican Party that they feel is theirs and that Donald Trump stole from them.
Got a bunch of questions, but I think we'll have to limit it to one or two more because I'm getting a message as well that it's time to wrap up. And I've got pages of things to discuss with you, everything from QAnon to militias to the Supreme Court, to the conservative Christians and how all this with the changing court, we won't get to it tonight. But I see a question here from Donna Shore and Jackie Shore. I would like to ask my wonderful former professor, what can we expect from a Trump presidential win? The above question is from Jacques Shore.
Hi, Jacques, and nice to hear from you. What can we expect from a Trump presidency second term? So the first term of any president is relatively constrained, because they're running for office again and they know they're going to run again. The last 4 years are far less constrained. And Donald Trump is not somebody who cares very much about the party. Some presidents in their second term worry about the shape they leave their party in and who their successor will be because they want their legacy preserved. For Donald Trump, none of these issues will be a concern. So I think if Stephen's description of the chaos and the angst of these last 4 years is accurate, and I think it is, you just multiply that by a factor of 10. He will be utterly unconstrained in what he does. The weakened institutions that I talked about, like the State Department and the executive branch, and the National Security Council, and all the institutions which are so important to calibrate policy, will continue to grow weaker. And I think, the way I describe, the way I think about the United States right now in the world, not only at home, is for a long time, the United States stood apart from the world, right until really World War I. So its involvement in the world is recent. Then it stood atop the world from 1945 until the turn of the century. Now it's amidst the world because, as you said, China will have the largest economy in the world, and there is power sharing that will go on for the next 25 to 30 years. And that requires a set of shrewd diplomatic skills and strategic capacity. 4 more years of erratic policy, devoid of strategy, the inability to build coalitions and engage with others to achieve your objectives could push the United States further down than simply amidst the world. Bad leadership exacts a terrible price. I know we have to quit, but as I think about this, just to make one more comment, Xi Jinping became General Secretary of China in 2012. It was all written in stone that the country would return to its overweening strength in China, that it would be represented on every business in the country, that there would be accelerated repression of the kind that we have seen in China for the last 8 years. He's a remarkably bad leader who made terrible choices for his country at a very important inflection point in their history. The consequences of bad leadership are unimaginable. That's why we need to treasure the good leaders that we have.
Talk about bad leaders. I have just a couple of more questions. They're so good. We have to ask them. From Ron Levy, how much of a threat do you perceive President Erdogan of Turkey to be?
So President Erdogan has grand ambitions. He's the first leader of modern Turkey to repudiate an entirely secular vision for Turkey. He has made space within Turkey for the Islamist parties. And actually, that's in some ways a success story because Islamist parties have integrated into the institutions in Turkey. But when you listen to Erdogan talk, he sees himself as the inheritor of the Ottoman tradition. So he said, Jerusalem is a Turkish story, right? It is an Ottoman story. It is an Ottoman capital. Do you remember the breadth of the Ottoman, penetration into Europe? It got as far as Vienna, right? In the West, and it ruled huge chunks of Asia and the Middle East. He's a man of grand ambitions, but those ambitions far exceed his reach, far exceed his capabilities. It is a fragile economy in Turkey and in the Middle East that the United States has left. It is Iran and Russia up against Turkey. And I can tell you, none of the three of them are having a good time right
now. So I'm going to come to the last question, although there are quite a few more. There are over 600,000 Americans presently in Canada. Any insight who they are and how they vote, and if they'll have any impact on the election? And let me just move this.
We don't know enough. The reason we don't know enough about the political attitudes of Americans who live in Canada is because when our pollsters do polls, they don't ask what your citizenship is. If you probably responded to pollsters on the phone, they don't ask you, are you a citizen of Canada? Or if not, where do you come from? Are you a citizen of another country? So frankly, we have no good data on that. Those 600,000 Americans, we don't really know how many of them are eligible to vote in a Canadian election, because many of them are here because they work for American companies who have big offices in Canada, but they are not necessarily either citizens or landed immigrants or eligible to vote. We in the universities, we're very interested in these questions now from two perspectives. We have 2 million talented Canadians outside this country. What are their attitudes? Do they see themselves as ambassadors for Canada? What are their political identifications? We are just starting in the universities to do research on these questions on both sides of the border. So the honest answer I can give that question is, we don't have any evidence to answer your question.
Oh, I understand. Okay, but I wanted to put it out there because people have been asking that question and it's been in the news. And now the final question will go to the Dean of Medicine from a university in Toronto, Dr. Arnold Aberman, whom you may know.
I sure do.
All the top diplomats may have left the Trump team, but these diplomats led to never-ending war. Trump, to his credit, has started no new wars. Alone among the past many presidents, he has been a peacemonger. Isn't that good?
That description of Trump is actually correct. Arnie is a fellow Montrealer, by the way, even though he's a former dean of medicine.
That's right.
At the University of Toronto. He's a Montrealer. Arnie is, you're right. Trump has started no new wars. And that derives very much from his America First strategy. He has said over and over again, America faces huge problems at home because it's been taken to the cleaners in trade agreements. That's his argument. And we should not be expending blood and treasure abroad. But this didn't start, to be fair, with Trump. It was Obama who refused to commit US troops to Syria. Yes, he increased American troops in Afghanistan significantly, but then drew them down. Yeah. So what we've really been seeing, and I think this is a much larger story about the United States that we all have to come to terms with, America has been withdrawing from all but what it considers its core interests. This is the future. That's not necessarily the best story for the world, but it is where the United States public opinion is, and I don't think that will change regardless of who becomes president.
I agree. And I have enough questions here that could keep us going for at least another 2 hours, but I am told I'm already 10 minutes over our time limit. So we're going to have to bring this to an end. And I'm going to call upon Mark Kaplan in one moment to thank you.
Just before you do, Stephen, if I can just say what a pleasure it has been for me to be with you, to be virtually in Montreal, if not physically in Montreal. When Louis called and asked if I would do this, it took me exactly 5 seconds because there's no friends like old friends. So thank you all.
Well, Janice, not only are you absolutely brilliant, but you are fully charming. You know that I had a phone call when this event was scheduled and someone said, do you know that I was in Janice and her twin sister Susie's class? And you know what? We were all intimidated by those two girls because they were so brilliant. And brilliant you are, as it came through tonight. This was a tour de force. And not only are you brilliant, I don't want to take away Mark's thank you, but you are so warm and so charming. And it's just an absolute delight for me to have had this honor of interviewing you and conversing with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I now pass it over to the co-chairman of Tuesday Night Learning, Mark Kaplan. Mark, please.
I must say that it was very exciting to watch you both interact and to listen to your tremendous, intelligent interpretations, your wisdom delivered with grace. Even though you say we're missing a lot of grace, you have it all. So we really appreciate you coming here to make this a very exciting evening for us all. And I also want to congratulate Stephen, who is a very important person. I don't know if you know that, at the Shar and in the Montreal community, because almost everybody I know and I read his output that he posts on the computer daily, and it's a necessary way to connect with what's happening in the Jewish world. And he certainly knows what he's doing, and it was a really exciting night, and I really appreciate that you came. And I'm thanking Louis for inviting you, and Stephen for doing a magnificent job. And there's not much else I can say, except I'm going to talk about going forward. Going forward, this is our last session for the fall. We're going to have another session for the spring. We are going to let everybody know what to expect when we figure out what we're going to do and how we're going to do it. The details will follow, and just everybody stay safe and have a good winter. And thank you very, very much.